They didn't explain what happened. They didn't argue. They just disappeared, and that silence hurts more than the actual breakup. Psychology shows us that when someone cuts off all emotion suddenly, it sets off an alarm in your brain. Not just sadness, it feels like danger. Expert Susan Anderson explains that this kind of abandonment doesn't first register in your thinking mind. It hits the older, primal part of your brain, the part wired for survival. That's why the pain feels so urgent. Your body reacts before your mind can even understand why. When someone cuts you off without a word, your nervous system panics, because not knowing feels like a threat. There's no reason given, no meaning to find, no signal that tells you it's safe to let go. And here's something most people don't expect. The person who disappears often feels a sense of relief, not because they didn't care, but because the silence stops a flood of emotion for them. In this psychology, this behavior isn't called cruelty. It's called flight, a survival response. For them, talking feels dangerous. Distance feels calming and in control. So if you've been asking yourself why the silence hurt more than the loss, this is the reason. Your brain wasn't just grieving. It was searching for safety. But the real shock doesn't come from being left alone. It comes from being left without any meaning. Rejection is painful, but not knowing is deeply unsettling. Susan Anderson explains that your mind can't close an emotional loop without some kind of meaning. When no explanation is given, your brain keeps scanning. It replays conversations. It rewrites moments. It's searching for the missing signal that would tell it the threat is over. This isn't obsession. It's a threat response. Your nervous system believes something dangerous is still unfinished, so it keeps that attachment alive. It makes it feel stronger and louder for longer. That's why people feel so stuck. It's why they can't just move on. Memories become intrusive instead of peaceful. In abandonment psychology, this state is called open abandonment. The emotional wound stays exposed because nothing sealed it. No explanation means no clear boundary, and no boundary means no feeling of safety. The pain gets worse, not because the love grows, but because the uncertainty grows. Your brain would rather hear a painful truth than no truth at all, because pain can be processed, not knowing cannot. And while the person left behind is caught in this spiral, the person who cut off feels calmer. Their anxiety drops. The silence works for them. But that relief comes at a cost, because what feels calming for one nervous system creates chaos in the other. This imbalance is the foundation of everything that happens next. The person who disappeared didn't escape emotion. They just postponed it. On the outside, their cutoff looks cold and final. Inside, it's the opposite. Susan Anderson explains that when emotional intensity crosses a certain line, their system shuts down, not by choice, but biologically. Their body reads connection as pressure. Questions feel invasive. Emotion feels like too much to handle. So their nervous system makes a fast decision. Escape first, understand later. This isn't calmness, it's a way to regulate. Silence lowers their heart rate. Distance quiets the internal noise. Avoidance brings instant relief. And that relief is powerful because it works, at least for a little while. Explaining would mean staying present inside the discomfort. It would mean facing guilt and facing the impact they had. It would mean a loss of control. So they disappear. Not to punish, but to stop the emotional flooding. From their point of view, silence feels safer than honesty. Distance feels cleaner than being vulnerable. But this calm is borrowed. It doesn't resolve anything. It freezes everything, and frozen emotions don't disappear. They wait. This pattern starts long before this relationship ever existed. Susan Anderson is clear. People don't just learn to disappear as adults. They learn it early. They learn it in places where emotional needs weren't met consistently, where closeness led to pain, where relying on someone felt risky. Their nervous system adapted. Attachment started to feel dangerous. Distance became their protection. So later in life, when intimacy grows, their body remembers, even if their mind doesn't. This is why some people leave when things get real, not when things are bad. Their system reads closeness as a warning sign, not as comfort. And when their fear of abandonment activates, logic shuts down. The survival brain takes over. Cutting off contact restores their balance, not emotionally, but physically. This is why explanations feel impossible for them, because explaining requires staying connected, and connection feels unsafe, so they repeat the pattern. They withdraw and detach and disappear, not because they lack emotion, but because emotion overwhelms them. And this conditioning doesn't fade on its own. It follows them into every bond until it's confronted. This is where shame quietly enters the picture. After a while, fear isn't the main driver anymore. Shame takes over. Susan Anderson explains that this shame isn't really about guilt. It's about exposure. Explaining means being seen. Being seen means being judged, and judgment feels unbearable to someone who is already on edge. Words create mirrors. Mirrors can show weakness. Silence hides it. For many who cut off contact, staying quiet protects how they see themselves. It lets them avoid facing how much they mattered to someone or how much they failed to handle. If they explain, they have to admit they were confused. They have to admit they were afraid. They have to admit they couldn't stay present. So their system chooses the option that saves their dignity. They disappear, not to hurt the other person, but to avoid feeling small. Susan Anderson describes this as protecting their identity. Silence becomes their armor. Distance becomes their control. And once shame gets involved, coming back becomes much harder, because going back would mean facing what they ran from. So the quiet stays. Not because they forgot, but because remembering hurts. This is where the person left behind starts telling themselves the wrong story. When silence stretches on, the mind rushes to fill the gap. Susan Anderson calls these abandonment distortions, thoughts shaped by stress, not by truth. The most common one sounds like this: I wasn't enough. Another one follows close behind. If I mattered, they would have explained. Then comes the hardest one. It must have all been fake. But psychology shows us something different. Meaning collapses under heavy emotional pressure. Your brain looks inward for answers, because none are coming from the outside. And the inward answers are usually harsh. These conclusions feel convincing, because pain demands an explanation. But they are built on missing information. And missing information warps your perception. Susan Anderson makes this clear. Silence does not mean they were indifferent. It signals their limitation. The person who left reached the edge of what they could cope with. That edge had nothing to do with your value. Yet the damage is real. Because your mind now links connection with instability. And once that link forms, it doesn't fade quietly. It changes how you feel safety from that point on. When someone cuts you off without a word, the impact doesn't end with the relationship. Your nervous system stays alert long after the contact ends. Trust weakens because safety was never restored. Your mind learns that connection can vanish without any warning. This makes you constantly scan for signs of loss in any future bond. Susan Anderson explains that unresolved abandonment changes how your brain evaluates closeness. Emotional attachment no longer feels stable. Even a neutral silence can feel threatening. Your body prepares for loss before it happens. Not because you are broken, but because your system is trying to prevent another shock. Over time, this state changes your behavior. People become cautious with their affection. They hesitate to depend on others. They watch tone and timing and distance more closely than words. Emotional openness feels risky because the last connection ended without any meaning. This is why many people say they changed after being cut off. They didn't become colder by choice. Their nervous system learned that sudden separation is possible at any moment. And without an explanation to anchor the ending, that lesson stays active. This damage doesn't mean the relationship mattered too much. It means it ended without psychological closure. And without closure, your body doesn't know when it's safe to stand down. People who cut off contact without explanation rarely come back to clarify. Not because they don't think about it, but because returning would wake up the same internal state that made them leave. Contact brings back the emotional pressure. Questions reopen feelings they worked so hard to quiet. The relief they got from distance vanishes the moment communication starts again. Susan Anderson explains that avoidance gets reinforced when it reduces internal discomfort. Silence keeps their emotions contained. Explaining would require staying present inside guilt and confusion. For someone whose system already feels overloaded by connection, this feels unbearable. There is also the fear of reopening the attachment. Even a brief explanation risks restoring emotional closeness, and closeness is exactly what their system learned to escape from. So the safest option remains distance, even if it looks cruel from the outside. Over time, the silence hardens. The longer they stay away, the harder it feels to return. What began as a temporary withdrawal becomes permanent, not by plan, but by default. Cutting someone off without a word is not a sign of emotional strength. It is a strategy used to regulate themselves when communication feels threatening. It stabilizes the person who leaves and destabilizes the person left behind. Susan Anderson's work shows that closure cannot come from someone who avoided connection to feel safe. Waiting for their answers keeps your abandonment wound open. Healing begins when you rebuild meaning without their help. The silence was not proof that the relationship lacked value. It was evidence that one person's nervous system reached its limit and chose distance for relief. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, but it removes the false belief that the ending defined your worth. When your sense of meaning no longer depends on someone else explaining themselves, your body can finally stand down. And that is where real recovery starts.